I'm not cynical enough to suggest that it's all about the money, but you can't ignore the fact that I think the Communist Party of China has given our universities through the years, don't hold me to this figure exactly, but about $150 million.
But the list goes on and on. We have a number of things that are very different between the perspectives of a free people in the United States of America and the leadership of China. And so I wonder whether these Confucius Institutes are part of an influence campaign by the Chinese government to shape attitudes in the minds of the American children, the coming generations, as to those kinds of differences. Is this really a propaganda effort, a mind-shaping effort of our young people being carried out through the auspices of these Confucius Institutes?
I would say generally the State Department supports international educational exchange. We support Americans learning critical languages.
That makes all the sense in the world, to study other languages and to learn about other cultures. But the question I have is whether the Chinese government is selecting individuals, funding for individuals into our educational institutions with the intent not just of letting us learn an important global language, but also and a different culture, but also to gain a perspective on a host of issues where they and we have different points of view.
Thank you for the question. I would say that in the course of the work that we did looking at Confucius Institutes, the one thing that really popped out for us was the variety of activities that they do. You know, you've certainly heard about the language training, and I think as Ranking Member Carper talked about in his statement, there are a variety of other cultural events that they focus on, holiday celebrations, cooking events, things like that. We didn't really focus on questions that you were focused on there, but I think that it's notable, the variety of activities that they perform.
Yeah, I'm not sensing anyone jumping to the bait on that.
Senator for Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to talk for a few minutes, Mr. President, about the good people of China, about Confucius Institutes, and the Chinese Communist Party. The Communist Party of China is trying to not only swallow China, it's trying to swallow the world. The Communist Party of China, being as aggressive as it is, has for a number of years reached out to our colleges and universities to establish what the Communist Party of China calls Confucius Institutes. And this was the pitch made by the government of China to our universities. We will give you bucket loads of money if you, our universities, American universities, will allow us to establish Confucius Institutes. These institutes run by the authoritarian government of China will not allow the free exchange of ideas. They will not allow anyone to talk about the Uyghurs or the people of Tibet or Hong Kong or what happened at Tiananmen Square. They meaning the Communist Party of China, has used these Confucius Institutes as propaganda arms. I have a bill. If kids, I shouldn't call them kids, if young people in our universities want to talk about Tibet, they get to talk about Tibet. And the bill would say that the universities have to take back control of these Confucius Institutes from the Communist Party of China. Otherwise, they're not going to be eligible for federal funds. The Senate passed it twice. Twice this bill has passed the United States Senate. The last time, with bipartisan support, we put the bill on the NDAA. And Mr. President, you know how conference committees work at the NDAA. Sometimes it's a ferret fire drill, and there's a lot of confusion, and somehow the Confucius Institute bill got watered down to do nothing. So I'm going to ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pass the Confucius Institute Act for a third time.
S-590, a bill to establish limitations regarding Confucius Institutes and for other purposes.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President.
What is the single most effective method of language education in the history of the world? Do you need a minute? You need a minute? Marriage. What is the second most effective method of language education in the history of the world? Prostitution. Governments have an astounding failure in the province of language education, even when they have the strongest and most strident motivation possible to succeed, and when they try to put the most resources imaginable into succeeding. This video is partly about politics, partly about propaganda, partly about strategic diplomacy between the United States and China, and it's partly about the politics of language education. And I am unusually qualified to speak about both. There was a time when I applied to become a citizen of Israel. In fact, there has been more than one occasion on which I started doing the paperwork to become a citizen of Israel, and you start making phone calls to people. I've told anecdotes with these funny conversations I had with the bureaucrats who handle that process. And, it seems less and less likely with each passing year that I will end up retiring in Israel, shall we say. But I would still say there is a more than 0% chance I will end up becoming a citizen of Israel eventually. The government of Israel has the strongest motivation in the world to have highly effective programs to teach the modern Hebrew language to new immigrants. And they have new immigrants coming from the United States of America, from France, from Russia, from Iraq, from Iran. It's remarkably multicultural and multilingual, just speaking within the Jewish population of Israel. It's also a country where the atheist minority are besieged by the religious majority and publish, in English, remarkably incisive criticisms of everything wrong with the institutions created and sustained by that religious majority. And we know, thanks to this skeptical minority of Israelis, that the language institutes in Israel are a total, utter failure. I read about this from a kind of academic perspective, just interested in what was going right, what was going wrong. And I read about it from the perspective of someone who was looking at the enormous challenge of struggling to learn Hebrew while continuing to improve my ability in Chinese. Okay, I was looking at this partly with my own self-interest in mind, partly out of just comparative interest. Right now, in the 21st century, the Canadian government has the strongest motivation imaginable to try to make a success out of education in Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, Mohawk, the indigenous languages of Canada. Okay, there is a remarkable pattern of governments failing, even when they have 110% commitment to language education as a focus, and when they have less than 110% commitment and less than an infinite budget, the rate of failure only increases from there. Now, I am not a libertarian. I am neither a left-wing libertarian, nor a right-wing libertarian, nor a centrist libertarian. I am in many ways an anti-libertarian, as it happens. The libertarian frame of mind with these things always goes, well, the government tried this project and it failed. Therefore, this will suddenly become successful and more cost-efficient and more effective. All kinds of profound problems will be solved the minute it's taken out of the government's hands and handed over to charity and the private sector to handle. As soon as civil society takes over, one way or the other. Yes. So you're telling me that if the coroner's office in New Orleans is, operating very poorly, getting very poor quality of service, very poor accuracy, very poor reliability, maybe long delays, maybe corruption. The coroner's office, that if we just take the responsibility for the coroner away from the government and give it to the private sector, all those problems will evaporate, right? Because when you take the same institution, operate it at a profit in a market context where it may only be possible to operate it at a loss, losing money, then it'll be a big set. How about the fire department? How about drinking water? How about sewage systems? I find the whole libertarian approach to these things fundamentally stupid. We're staring into the unbelievable, abominable failure of elite level education in the United States of America in the 21st century. And one of the most crucial, one of the most important failures of all is indeed what they call education in strategically important languages. Have you heard of this war in Iraq thing? You heard about the war in Afghanistan? How many people have you met in your entire life who studied any of those languages? And I'm sorry, but here we can't count people. If you know some refugees or you know some immigrants or you know some people who are actually born and raised in those cultures, no. Americans whose mother language at home was English and English only, but who sat down to learn, to crack open the books and start learning Dari or Pashto or one of the salient dialects of Arabic with the same spirit whereby ambitious young men in the British Empire sat down and started studying Sanskrit so that they could get a good posting in the colonies in India. Okay, now, the British Empire, I am not applauding. It was bad and sick and evil and wrong. In its earlier phase, it was built on slavery. In its later phase, it was built on the opium trade. Great story. Could talk about another video, right? I'm not speaking in support of the British Empire. But pretty much anytime you ask a specialist, what was the difference between the British Empire period and the American, more vaguely imperialist period in the Middle East? Specialists will say again and again, the people the British sent over, they were scholarly. America, innumerable advantages over the British Empire, innumerable advantages over every other empire that's ever existed in the history of the world. I could praise the American Empire in many ways. You know what? The only guys who became fluent in Vietnamese during the Vietnamese War were the guys who got married to local Vietnamese women or the guys who slept with a whole lot of Vietnamese prostitutes. Okay? Today, why don't you just look around universities in the United States of America? Where are your learned men who are fluent in Vietnamese? And where are your learned men who are fluent in the languages of Afghanistan, Central Asia, Iraq? This is not a feature of the American Empire. And there is a critical shortage of Americans learning Chinese, especially when you talk about learning the Chinese language at a high enough level to be capable of dealing with Chinese politics. This is not merely being able to give a guided tour to tourists. If the Confucius Institute existed in the United States of America in order to transmit the language and to train people to have that level of language ability, or any language, any level of language ability whatsoever, all right, it would be worth much, much more than $150 million. It would be something absolutely priceless for the United States of America, and it would be a strategic asset for the United States of America. And it is not. The Confucius Institute has existed from the first day of its inception and its implementation as a strategic asset for the government of China, which, yes, happens to be the Communist Party that rules China. It exists for absolutely no other reason than to advance the interests of the government of China in the United States of America. It's a little bit of a different story if we're talking about the rest of the world. Now, what is the agenda of the Confucius Institute in the United States of America? I happen to be vegan. And a lot of forms of vegan activism are really counterproductive and fail and frankly ruin people's lives and put people in prison. And I'm a critic of a lot of the things that vegans do to try to advance the vegan cause. But one of the things I point out is now every so often you walk into a coffee shop and sitting there in front of you as you're staring at the counter is the word vegan. And maybe it's there 4 or 5 times because there are some muffins and some cookies on sale. And next to them in parentheses, it says vegan. Oh, this is a chocolate mousse. This is a vegan chocolate mousse. And I know there are little kids who walk into that coffee shop with their mom, holding their mom's hands, say, oh, vegan, what does that mean? Like, oh, gee, there are 2 cookies and they look the same, but one says vegan. And it's possible the mom will say, shut up, forget about it. It's possible the mom will say, there is a kind of propaganda function just in communicating to children and communicating to young people, hey, veganism exists. Veganism matters. Veganism is an option. Veganism is a competing worldview. In some ways, equal to and counterposed to the other worldview represented by the chocolate cookie that doesn't say vegan next to it. Oh, there's milk and then there's vegan milk. In this way, China does profoundly influence people's lives. What kind of people? People like my own father. People like my own mother. People who don't think they're spineless followers, but really they are. I heard a really tragic interview today with an old man. He was talking about his youth, and he was talking honestly about how he listened to a rap album and it made him decide to become a crack cocaine dealer. And he was talking about how he got out of prison and he already decided to live a better life, but then he went back to his neighborhood and he basically just came into contact with what happened to be in fashion in his neighborhood, rap music and other things culturally, and he got back into, formally joined a gang and got involved with gang violence and murdering people, raping people too. He was willing to admit this. He was willing to admit his involvement in past rapes, murders, and so on. And he was fundamentally willing to admit that he did this because he was a follower, because he wanted to fit in, because he wanted to be cool like the other guys. And he talked about his desire to be manly and important and real and the different, totally irrational, yearnings behind these decisions on his part. None of you would listen to a rap album and decide to become a drug dealer or a murderer or a rapist because you listen to a rap song, right? It seems laughable. It seems ridiculous to everybody except the people who actually do it. The guy I saw an interview with today, he's all grown up now. I'm sure if you were talking to him back when he was 21 or 20 or 22 years old or something, this would not have been a laughing matter for him. This would have been his life. This was the path he was committed to. He thought of himself as a rebel when he was really the weakest and most spineless conformist of them all. He was the most susceptible to influence, okay? My father was raised by a single mother in a steel town, and her job was in a steel factory. She did paperwork. Back in those days, they didn't have women doing the heavy lifting or pouring molten steel, but she worked in a steel factory, okay? My father had every privilege imaginable handed to him, in part because the teachers in his school wanted to be kind and encouraging and hand him opportunities, because he was a poor kid from a single-parent family in a steelworking town. I have never had any teacher have any kind of positive attitude towards me, such as he completely took for granted. And he responded to all this by deciding that what he wanted to be was a rebel. And the reason why he responded to Chinese propaganda, and the reason why he became a devoted follower of Mao Zedong, and the reason why he became a member of a communist, extremist, rebel faction, which I'm not even going to get into describing here, in Canada, despite his privilege, despite the fact he was given a scholarship to go and get a PhD, which he dropped out of, by the way. He didn't ever get it. Despite all the numerous advantages in his life, right? He thought he was being a rebel. He thought he was being a real man. He thought he was being strong, when what he was doing was proving to us all that he is the most susceptible to influence, that he's the weakest of us all. So many of us can pick up that same rap album and we can laugh at it, or we can listen to it as a kind of wistful reflection from someone about drug dealing and pimping and maybe even, contract killing, whatever the rap lyrics are about. No, isn't that interesting? That's someone singing about his experiences in life. We don't feel any need to follow this person as our leader. We don't feel any need to emulate them or be like them. The guy I heard the interview with today, he was saying explicitly that he thought his own criminal career originated from, above all else, the absence of a father figure in his life. And he doesn't know why. For whatever reason, there's something there they're looking for, they reach out for, right? And my father was the one guy who picked up the same pamphlets promoting Mao Zedong and Chinese communism that you or I or any reasonable person would just have a laugh at or regard wistfully or think, oh, that's interesting. Here's someone writing about their experience fighting against the Japanese. Maybe it's just interesting. We just regard it wistfully. Maybe we don't laugh at it, but what does that have to do with me? I'm not gonna become a cult flunky for this story. There was this powerful delusion from my father that he was going to lead the revolution. The problem is, it wasn't his revolution. It was somebody else's. He would never be a leader. He would always be a sheep. He would always be a follower. Because it was Joseph Stalin's revolution, or it was Mao Zedong's revolution, or it was Che Guevara, the Cuban Revolution, right? It was never his. He never got past that childlike view of the world, of reaching out for heroes, reaching out for an absent father figure, right? He never took the next step of realizing these people were just creative writers. These people just took a blank sheet of paper and wrote down their ideas and tried to change the world at some point, creatively, soon enough, destructively, right? He never really started a revolution of his own. He never started writing his own questions and then coming to his own answers. And of course, the greatest joke of all is, when you live this way, when you live as an imitation of Christ, you're not Christ, you're living in imitation of Christ. You're not a revolutionary, you're living as an imitation of a revolutionary. And the other guy I mentioned, maybe you're not a real gangster. Maybe you're a second-rate imitation of a gangster. You're imitating a rap song, right? This isn't who you are. This is an act. No matter how deeply you commit to it, no matter how much you want to believe this is who you really are, it's not, right? The other bitter irony is, right, no matter how hard you try, you're never going to be Cambodian, you're never going to be Vietnamese, you're never going to be Chinese, you're never going to really understand their struggle. And your attempt to recreate that struggle in Canada, your attempt to do a second-rate knockoff imitation of Chinese communism in Canada for the Canadian climate, shall we say, for the Canadian political context, right? That is going to be, at best, ridiculous. It's never going to have the character of something that developed in that country, in that culture, by those people, by the people, of the people, for the people. The danger of the Confucius Institute is greater precisely because it's so easily ignored. And it's ignored because we all want to ignore people like my father. Nobody wants to deal with them. Within the classroom or amongst your brothers and sisters, if you've got nothing, nobody wants to deal with your brother or your cousin who's become addicted to following conspiracy theories on the internet. And then you find out he went to Washington, D.C. and participated in a riot and got himself put in prison. Nobody wants to deal with your uncle or your nephew who's becoming a member of the KKK. He's more and more racist. And then you find out how far he's taken it, that he went down the rabbit hole into extremism. How dangerous is the Confucius Institute compared to Christianity on our university campuses, compared to Mormonism, compared to Hasidic Judaism, compared to Islam? There are myriad ideologies that are on university campuses, and they are open for business, and they are recruiting today. The ultimate reason politically why nobody wants to deal with putting down a hard limit to the Confucius Institute and what it can and cannot do is that it's going to lead people in the United States of America to question their own communist parties, their own neo-Nazi parties, their own, miscellaneous extremist parties. The greatest, least examined, most unquestioned form of radicalism of all is boring mainstream Christianity. And far more people will decide that they want to fall into lockstep and become the followers of some form of Protestantism or some form of Catholicism every day, in the same way that my father was seduced by Chinese communism, and others find other ways to rebel through mindless conformism. Maybe we can practice doing puppetry together.
Yes, that's all I needed. I need it all.